Okay, guys, today what we're going over is the 60s. It says a decade of protest and change. So this is all the 60s. Um, our first president we're going over in the 60s is going to be President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. He was president from 1960 to 1963. Now you can see that here he doesn't do his full 4 years because he is going to be assassinated in 1963. So we'll go over that at the end of the PowerPoint. It says it was the first televised debate against Richard M. Nixon, right? It was the first debate on TV where the presidents debated against each other, JFK and Richard M. Nixon. He was the youngest man to be elected president. A lot of people said that because it was televised and the way they looked is the reason why JFK actually won over Nixon. But again, that's just what some people believe. One of the important quotes from him, it says, "Ask not what you can do for your country or what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," right? And there you have JFK. Now, domestic policy under Kennedy. Domestic, again, is what we're doing here at home in the United States. Now, his policy is called the New Frontier. And he proposed tax cuts, creation of Medicare, civil rights legislation. Again, this is during the civil rights movement, and he increased aid to education. Again, he proposed it. It's not that it actually went through. None were passed under Kennedy. He did create the Peace Corps, where volunteers go to developing countries to share their skills. It could be any kind of skills, right? So that's the Peace Corps. Now, the space race announced that America would place a man on the moon before the end of the 60s. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Remember, Sputnik was the first man-made satellite in orbit, and that was from the Soviet Union. So it freaked out the United States. So now we are in this race to beat them in other accomplishments. In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first men on the moon. And again, this is going to come 6 years after JFK passes away. But he did promise that by the end of the decade that we would have a man on the moon, and we did in 1969. Right? Now, the impact of space exploration, satellites with improved television and radio signals. So, of course, you're going to have more satellites in space now. Communication, the prediction of weather and forecast, the ability to forecast natural disasters improved. Telephone calls overseas and the use of GPS. All of this was created with the increase of satellites in space. Now, foreign policy. Foreign meaning how we're dealing with countries overseas. Foreign policy under Kennedy is going to be pretty intense. Kennedy opposed communism, right, just like all of our presidents before him did, which are Truman, Eisenhower, and now we are at Kennedy, 1960. He opposed communism and he pledged to contain it. In 1959, Fidel Castro led an uprising against Cuban dictator General Batista. Right, that's Fidel Castro. In 1959. And it was a Cuban revolution. The United States thought Castro would implement a democracy, right? We thought that that's what he wanted. However, he made Cuba communist. So, of course, it's going to freak us out. In 1959, Eisenhower approved a plan to overthrow Castro. In 1959, Kennedy became president in 1960. Cuban exiles were secretly trained. Anybody who was kicked out of Cuba, we trained them to actually go and kind of attack Cuba. Kennedy took office and carried on the plan without the use of air power. Right, so this is going to be Cuba, and 90 miles from Cuba is going to be Florida. The exiles were quickly defeated by the Cuban military and embarrassed the Kennedy administration, and that's the Bay of Pigs invasion, where we train these exiles to attack Cuba, and it's a fail. Once they get caught, they say it's the United States, they're the ones that trained us, and it becomes a huge drama. Alliance for Progress in 1961 created a program of grants and loans to Latin American nations to promote economic progress, land reform, and trade. So this is for us to help Latin America. The Berlin Wall went up in 1961. Kennedy met with Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Nikita Khrushchev is going to be the ruler, the leader of communist Russia, right? This is after Joseph Stalin. And they meet face to face in Vienna. It didn't go well, and the construction of the Berlin Wall began, right? So here you can see the construction of the Berlin Wall. It cut off access to the west for East Berliners, right? So people from the east, from East Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, weren't allowed to go into the west and vice versa. And there you see it a couple years later. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Exiles from the Bay of Pigs incident were instructed to say that they were acting independently, but they didn't, right? So the people that we sent in the Bay of Pigs invasion, we told them to say that they were on their own. They didn't. They pointed a finger at the United States. So Castro and Khrushchev, right, from the Soviet Union and Cuba, were aware that the United States was behind it, and they wanted to protect Cuba. So the United States sent spy planes over Cuba, and they discovered that Cuba was preparing for missiles with nuclear warheads. And it freaked us out, and that is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. We felt that in Havana they had missiles that could reach all the way to Denver, can reach Houston, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, and Washington, right? So of course it's going to freak us out. This is October 1962. The United States sent a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent nuclear weapons from being delivered. This is the most tense and closest it has ever been to getting into a nuclear war, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw missiles if the United States pledged to not invade Cuba. Kennedy agreed to pull out missiles in Turkey, right? Because Turkey is closer to the Soviet Union, so that way we take the ones out from Turkey, they take out the ones from Cuba, and we're all good. This would be the hotline. And it banned nuclear testing above ground. Now, the Johnson presidency, 1963 to 1968. LBJ is now president. Kennedy was assassinated November 22nd, 1963, while he was riding down, in a parade in Dallas. Okay, there you can see Kennedy, and there you can see his wife, Jackie. Vice president becomes president now, right? So here you have Mrs. Kennedy, you have his kids, and of course you have the brother there, Robert. So in the plane, here you have Miss Kennedy. Here you have LBJ. He is being sworn in as they are flying JFK's corpse over to Washington. Now, LBJ is the Great Society. He believed in civil rights. He created the Civil Rights Act that we went over before in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, affirmative action, the Medicare Act of 1965, which provided health care for people over the age of 65, the War on Poverty, Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. He created the Job Corps, which we still have today, and he provided aid to cities, which is going to be like the ghettos and the inner cities, where it's more populated. Urban planning, slum clearing, and rental assistance and reconstruction. Now, changes in immigration policy. You have the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952, which kept immigration quotas favoring Western Europe, right? Favoring Western Europe. The Western part, which are the NATO countries that are supporting democracy. The Immigration Act of 1965 restricted immigration from Latin America. Now, Johnson's landslide election, 1964, you have Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona. That is his opposition, right? So LBJ becomes president in 1963. In 1964, he's due for re-election, and the person he's going against is Barry Goldwater. He revived conservatism. He was an extremist. We'll go over a couple of videos with his extremist views. And now we have the failure of the Great Society. There's still poverty. Vietnam became too expensive. He did not seek re-election. And then we're going to get into the Vietnam War, which is going to be from 1954 to 1973. So we are going to continue with their presidencies, but when we go over the Vietnam War. If you have any questions, you let me know.